I used to think winning was everything. Then the only person I could never beat asked me for a date, and somehow that terrified me more than losing ever had. My name is Ethan Brooks, and if there was one constant in my life, it was Liam Carter standing exactly where I wanted to be. It started when we were kids at a county science fair outside Columbus, Ohio. I still remember the smell of popcorn drifting across the fairgrounds while I stood beside my homemade volcano, convinced I had first place locked up. Then Liam walked in carrying a neat little engineering project that looked like it belonged in a college lab instead of an 8th grade competition. He smiled at me before the judges arrived. Not a smug smile, just a friendly one. Somehow that made it even worse. He won by 3 points. 3. I told myself it didn't matter. Then high school happened. Debate tournaments, robotics competitions, cross-country invitationals, art showcases, academic decathlons. Every single time I climbed toward the top, Liam was already there waiting, holding another trophy with that annoyingly calm expression. It became a running joke among teachers. If Ethan finishes first, Liam will finish first. Everyone laughed. I didn't. Somewhere along the way, competing against him stopped being something I chose. It became part of my identity. My mornings started with practice, my evenings ended with studying, and every goal I set had the same invisible footnote attached to it. Beat Liam Carter. Friends asked why I cared so much. I always shrugged and blamed my competitive streak. The truth was harder to admit. I couldn't remember who I was without trying to outrun him. College only made things worse. We both enrolled at Lakeshore University, somehow ending up on neighboring floors in the same residence hall. Different majors, same honors program. Different classes, same campus competitions. It felt like the universe had signed an exclusive sponsorship deal with my frustration. Whenever I heard applause echoing through an auditorium, I already knew whose name would be announced. Liam never bragged. He never rubbed a victory in my face. He'd congratulate me after every event, offer a handshake, sometimes even compliment my work. That should have made me respect him. Instead, it made me train harder. If he had been arrogant, I could have hated him without feeling guilty. But Liam Carter had the infuriating habit of being decent. That made every loss sting twice as much. By senior year, our rivalry had become campus legend. Freshmen whispered whenever we entered the same room. Student newspapers compared our grades, internships, and competition records like we were rival athletes instead of exhausted college seniors surviving on coffee and determination. Professors placed friendly bets over who would finish ahead each semester. I pretended not to notice. Liam definitely noticed. Sometimes I'd catch him looking my way before a competition began, his expression thoughtful, almost concerned, but the moment our eyes met, he'd flash that familiar smile. I always looked away first. Then came the announcement that changed everything. The National Innovation Challenge was finally accepting applications. The winning team would earn a 6-figure job offer, mentorship from industry leaders, and the kind of opportunity people spent years chasing. It wasn't just another contest. It was the contest, the one every ambitious senior dreamed about. I stared at the announcement on my phone until my coffee went cold. Finally, I thought, one last chance, one final competition, one clean ending to a rivalry that had followed me for over a decade. I had no idea that fate wasn't preparing me for my greatest victory. It was preparing me to question why I had been trying so desperately to beat Liam Carter in the first place. The application process opened on a rainy Monday morning, and by lunchtime the entire engineering building felt like it was running on pure adrenaline. Posters for the National Innovation Challenge covered every bulletin board. Professors casually mentioned it before lectures, and students who normally ignored each other suddenly exchanged ambitious plans over coffee. I had already downloaded every requirement, highlighted every deadline, and filled an entire notebook with ideas before most people had even finished reading the announcement. This was my chance to leave Lakeshore University with something bigger than a diploma. I could almost see the future waiting on the other side of that competition. There was only one problem. Liam Carter was definitely applying too. I spotted him later that afternoon in the design studio, leaning over a drafting table with several classmates gathered around him. He was explaining something with that calm confidence that somehow never sounded arrogant. Everyone listened. Everyone smiled. I rolled my eyes before turning away, telling myself I had better things to do than wonder why he made leadership look so effortless. 2 days later, the university hosted an information session inside the business auditorium. Every seat was filled. Faculty members stood along the walls while seniors crowded the aisles hoping to hear some secret that would improve their odds. The competition director stepped onto the stage, welcomed everyone, and spent nearly an hour describing judging criteria, travel schedules, interviews, and the final presentation in Chicago. I wrote down every word. Then came the announcement that drained every bit of excitement from the room. This year, the competition committee had changed the rules. Individual entries would no longer be accepted. Every project had to be created by a team of exactly 2 students whose academic backgrounds complemented one another. The auditorium erupted into whispers. My stomach tightened. A team? I had spent 4 years trusting only my own work. Depending on someone else sounded like an unnecessary risk. The director smiled as if he had expected the reaction. He explained that the professional world rewarded collaboration, adaptability, and communication just as much as talent. Then he added one final detail. Faculty advisors had already reviewed student records and selected the pairings based on performance, leadership, and technical strengths. We would not choose our own partners. A volunteer began handing out sealed envelopes. One by one, students opened them, laughing, groaning, or celebrating depending on the name inside. My envelope suddenly felt heavier than paper should. I broke the seal, unfolded the letter, and stared at the words until they blurred together. Partner assignment. Ethan Brooks. Liam Carter. I honestly wondered if someone had planned the whole thing as an elaborate joke. Around the room, I heard surprised voices repeating our names. Apparently, our rivalry had become entertaining enough that half the campus considered this pairing inevitable. I looked across the auditorium at the exact moment Liam opened his envelope. His eyebrows lifted in genuine surprise before he found me through the crowd. For a second, neither of us moved. Then, unbelievably, he laughed. Not at me. More like someone who had just accepted that life enjoyed impossible plot twists. He walked toward me while students stepped aside to let him pass. I folded the letter and slipped it into my backpack before he reached me. Looks like we are partners, he said with an easy smile. Looks like someone upstairs has a strange sense of humor, I answered. He chuckled quietly instead of arguing. We do not have to like each other, he said. We just have to build the best project in the country. I wanted to disagree. I wanted to tell him there was no chance this would work. Instead, I found myself nodding despite every instinct telling me to walk away. Because for the first time in more than 10 years, beating Liam Carter was no longer an option. If I wanted the future I had dreamed about, I was going to have to stand beside him instead. Working with Liam turned out to be exactly as exhausting as I had predicted, which was impressive considering my expectations had already been incredibly low. We reserved a small project room on the 3rd floor of the Innovation Center, a space with whiteboards covering every wall, tall windows overlooking the campus quad, and a conference table that somehow became our battlefield before the first hour was over. I arrived 20 minutes early with color-coded notes, market research, and 3 possible concepts already outlined. Liam walked in carrying nothing except a laptop, a reusable water bottle, and the irritating confidence of someone who looked completely unbothered. Morning, he said. You are late, I replied automatically. He glanced at the clock. I am exactly on time. I hated that he was right. We spent the next 2 hours disagreeing about almost everything. I wanted efficiency. He wanted experimentation. I trusted data. He trusted observation. Every suggestion from one of us immediately became a reason for the other to argue. By lunchtime, my notebook was filled with crossed-out ideas, sarcastic comments scribbled in the margins, and one sentence that simply read, "Why is he like this?" Liam noticed it while reaching for a marker. He laughed under his breath, but wisely chose not to mention it. The strange part was that every time we challenged each other, the project quietly became stronger. My practical planning filled the gaps in his creative concepts, while his unexpected solutions forced me to rethink assumptions I had accepted without question. Neither of us admitted it aloud. That would have felt too much like surrender. Our classmates noticed before we did. Whenever we left the project room together, people watched us with amused expressions, waiting to see whether we would argue in the hallway. Professor Alvarez even stopped us after class one afternoon. You two finally decided to work together, she said with a smile. The rest of us have been waiting 4 years for this. Liam thanked her politely. I muttered something that sounded vaguely appreciative before escaping toward the library. The teasing only became worse after that. Friends joked that the campus had lost its favorite rivalry because we were now spending more time together than anyone else in our graduating class. They were technically correct. Between planning sessions, prototype testing, faculty meetings, and late evening brainstorming, I probably saw Liam more than my own roommate. It felt unnatural. It also became impossible to ignore little details I had somehow missed over the years. He always remembered the names of custodians and cafeteria staff. He refilled the printer whenever it jammed without making a big deal about it. He left encouraging notes on shared draft documents instead of criticizing mistakes. One evening, after nearly 6 hours of revisions, I rubbed my eyes and realized I had skipped dinner. Before I could stand, Liam quietly placed a paper bag on the table. "Turkey sandwich," he said. "You always forget to eat when you are focused." I blinked at him. "How would you know that?" His answer came so naturally that it caught me completely off guard. "Because you have done it before almost every competition we have ever entered." The room suddenly felt much quieter. I stared at the sandwich, then back at him, unsure what surprised me more, the fact that he had noticed, or the fact that he had remembered for years. Before I could ask another question, his phone buzzed with a calendar reminder. He glanced at the screen, stood up, and smiled that familiar calm smile. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked. I hesitated for only a second before answering. "Do not be late." He laughed as he walked toward the door. "I never am." After he disappeared into the hallway, I sat alone in the fading evening light, wondering why someone I had always considered my greatest obstacle seemed to know me better than most of my closest friends. That question stayed with me all the way home, quietly refusing to let go. The next week settled into a routine that felt strangely comfortable, even if neither of us would have admitted it out loud. Every morning, I claimed the same chair in our project room before Liam arrived exactly on time with a fresh coffee and another idea that would probably challenge everything I had planned. Every afternoon we debated, revised, erased, and rebuilt until the whiteboards looked like controlled chaos. Somewhere between our endless discussions, the sharp edges of our rivalry began wearing themselves down. They did not disappear. They simply changed shape. We still argued over layouts, budgets, presentation slides, and technical details, but the arguments slowly became conversations instead of contests. I noticed it during a prototype review. I pointed out a flaw in his design, expecting the usual back and forth. Instead, Liam studied it for a moment and nodded. "You are right," he said. I blinked. "That is it." He smiled. "Did you want a dramatic speech first?" I laughed before I could stop myself. The sound surprised both of us. It was probably the first genuine laugh we had shared in years. After that, the room felt lighter. We started finishing each other's ideas instead of interrupting them. When one of us became stuck, the other quietly stepped in without turning it into a competition. It was unsettling how naturally it happened. One evening, we stayed on campus long after sunset, determined to finish our first working prototype before the weekend. The Innovation Center had almost emptied, leaving only the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant buzz of a floor buffer somewhere down the hallway. I stretched my shoulders, realizing I had been staring at the same screen for nearly 3 hours. Liam stood by the window, looking out across the quiet campus where streetlights reflected off sidewalks still damp from an afternoon rain. "Do you ever stop thinking?" he asked without turning around. "Only when I am asleep." "I am not convinced you even stop then." I smiled despite myself. "You sound very confident for someone who has never seen me sleeping." He chuckled softly. "Fair point." A comfortable silence settled between us. Not awkward, just quiet. It felt unfamiliar in the best possible way. My attention drifted toward the table where Liam had left his backpack unzipped. A small notebook rested halfway outside the front pocket. I recognized the cover immediately because I had seen him carrying it for years at competitions, always tucked under one arm before an event began. Curiosity tugged at me. I told myself not to look. Then Liam's phone rang somewhere down the hall, where he had stepped out to answer a call from Professor Alvarez. I glanced toward the open doorway. He was still talking. My eyes returned to the notebook. I reached for it before I could talk myself out of it. I did not intend to read anything personal. I only wanted to know why he guarded that notebook so carefully. As I lifted it, something slipped free from between the pages and drifted onto the table. It was an old photograph. I picked it up carefully. The picture showed 2 teenagers standing on a competition stage nearly 8 years earlier. One of them was me, awkwardly holding a second-place ribbon with an expression that clearly said I hated losing. Beside me stood Liam with a first-place medal around his neck. What stopped me cold was not the picture itself. It was the fact that the edges had been worn soft from being handled again and again. Before I could process that thought, another item slid from the notebook. Then another. More photographs. Old event badges. Newspaper clippings from competitions. Every single one included me. My heartbeat slowed as confusion replaced curiosity. Why would Liam keep all of this? Why would someone save memories from a rivalry that only one of us had ever seemed eager to continue? The question echoed through my mind just as I heard his footsteps returning down the hallway. My fingers were still resting on the stack of photographs when Liam stepped back into the room. The conversation he had been having ended the moment he saw what was lying across the table. His smile disappeared, replaced by an expression I had never seen before. It was not anger. It was not embarrassment either. It looked more like someone who had spent years carefully building a wall only to watch a single loose brick fall out. Neither of us spoke. The silence stretched so long that I could hear the heating system humming above us. Finally, I lifted one of the photographs. What is all this? My voice sounded calmer than I felt. Liam closed the door behind him and walked over slowly, stopping on the opposite side of the table. He looked down at the photographs instead of meeting my eyes. I was wondering when you would find those. I blinked. You were wondering? He gave a quiet laugh that carried no humor. Eventually, yes. I picked up an old newspaper clipping from a statewide robotics competition. There I was, standing beside him on the podium almost 6 years ago. The article mentioned both of our names. The edges of the clipping were worn from being folded and unfolded countless times. You kept everything, I whispered. Almost everything, Liam admitted. My confusion only deepened. Why? He did not answer immediately. Instead, he carefully gathered a few photographs into a neat stack, almost as if buying himself time. Do you remember the first science fair? He asked. I nodded. You beat me by 3 points. Liam smiled faintly. That is what you remember. I frowned. What else was there? His eyes finally met mine. They looked unusually soft, carrying years of memories I had apparently never noticed. You were the only person who congratulated me that day. I searched my memory. The fairgrounds. The noisy crowd. The judges. Then, buried beneath years of frustration, I found a faint image of myself shaking hands with a nervous boy who had expected everyone to dislike him for winning. I had forgotten it completely. Liam had not. After that, he continued quietly, I always hoped we would meet again. I stared at him without saying a word. When we ended up entering the same competitions, I thought it was incredible. You always pushed yourself harder than anyone else. Competing against you made me better. I shook my head slowly. So you saved newspaper articles because you respected your rival? Another small laugh escaped him. That would have been easier to explain. The words settled between us. Easier to explain. My heartbeat quickened. There was something he still was not saying, something sitting just beneath the surface. Before I could ask another question, he reached into the notebook and pulled out a folded sheet of paper that looked older than everything else. The corners were creased, and the ink had faded slightly with time. He held it for a second before handing it to me. Go ahead, he said softly. You should read it. I unfolded the page carefully. At the top was a date from our sophomore year of high school. Underneath it was a handwritten list titled, Goals Before Graduation. The first few entries were ordinary. Win the Regional Design Championship. Earn a college scholarship. Study industrial design. Then my eyes reached the final line. The handwriting looked slightly uneven, as though the writer had hesitated before finishing it. Someday, tell Ethan how I really feel. I stopped breathing for what felt like several seconds. The room around me seemed to disappear until all I could hear was the quiet rustle of paper between my fingers. Slowly, almost afraid of the answer, I looked back up at Liam. He was already watching me with an expression that held no expectation, no pressure, only years of patient honesty. In that moment, I realized something that completely unraveled everything I believed about our rivalry. While I had spent more than a decade trying to defeat Liam Carter, he had been spending those same years hoping I would finally see him. My eyes remained fixed on the faded handwriting long after the words had stopped making sense. I read the last line again, then a third time, almost expecting the ink to rearrange itself into something easier to understand. It never did. I folded the paper carefully and placed it back on the table between us. How long? I asked quietly. Liam let out a slow breath. Since we were 14. I laughed once, but there was no humor in it. That is impossible. I know it sounds that way. No, I said, shaking my head. It is impossible because if that were true, then everything I believed for the last 10 years was completely wrong. He nodded without defending himself. Probably. The honesty in that single word hit harder than any argument ever could. I walked toward the window, needing somewhere else to look. Outside, students crossed the quad carrying backpacks and coffee cups, laughing as they hurried toward evening classes. The world kept moving while mine seemed to have stopped completely. Why did you never tell me? I finally asked. Liam leaned against the edge of the conference table, folding his arms loosely. Because every time I thought about saying something, another competition came along. I frowned. That does not explain anything. It explains everything, he replied gently. You love competing. Every time you looked at me, your eyes lit up. Maybe because you wanted to beat me, but they still lit up. I was afraid that if I admitted how I felt, you would stop looking at me altogether. I turned back toward him. So you just kept competing? He smiled, almost embarrassed. It was the only excuse I had to stay close to you. I searched his face for even the smallest sign that this was some elaborate joke. There was nothing except quiet sincerity. You know what is funny? He continued. People always assumed I enjoyed winning because of the trophies. They never realized my favorite part was knowing you would be there too. I rubbed a hand across my forehead, trying to untangle years of memories that suddenly looked completely different. Every congratulation, every handshake, every conversation after a competition. I had interpreted all of them as confidence from someone who always came out ahead. What if they had been something else entirely? There were times I wanted to lose on purpose, Liam admitted with a small laugh. My head snapped toward him. You are lying. I am not. You hate losing. Not to you. The room fell silent again. He looked down for a moment before speaking once more. Do you remember the state design finals during junior year? I nodded slowly. You stayed after the ceremony because your presentation model broke. You helped me repair it, I said. You told everyone it was only fair because the judges had already finished scoring. Liam smiled. The truth is I had another reason. What reason? I wanted 5 more minutes with you before we went home. My chest tightened in a way I had never experienced before. None of this fit the story I had spent years telling myself. The rival I had measured every success against had never been trying to push me away. He had been quietly finding reasons to remain part of my life. I do not expect anything from you, Liam said after another long silence. You do not have to say anything tonight. I only wanted you to know that none of it was fake. The competitions mattered. Our project matters. But meeting you always mattered more. I looked at the notebook, the photographs, the old newspaper clippings, and finally back at the man standing across from me. For the first time since I had known Liam Carter, I was completely speechless, not because I had lost an argument, but because I had just discovered that the person I thought understood me the least had quietly understood me all along. That night, I did not sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling of my dorm room while every memory from the past 10 years replayed in a completely different order. It felt like watching the same movie after. Learning the ending, scenes I had barely noticed suddenly carried new meaning. Every handshake, every encouraging smile, every quiet conversation after another competition. I had always believed Liam looked at me as someone standing in his way. Now I wondered if I had been the one standing in front of something I never bothered to see. The next morning I arrived at the Innovation Center before sunrise, hoping the empty building would somehow organize the chaos in my head. Instead, it only made the silence louder. I opened my laptop, stared at the project files, and realized I had been reading the same paragraph for nearly 15 minutes without understanding a single word. My concentration was gone. Around 8 o'clock, the familiar sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Liam walked into the room carrying 2 cups of coffee like he always did. He paused for a second after seeing me already there. Good morning, he said carefully. Morning. He placed 1 coffee beside my notebook without asking if I wanted it. He already knew the answer. We worked quietly for almost an hour. Usually we challenged every design decision within minutes. But today neither of us seemed willing to disturb the fragile peace hanging over the room. Finally, I closed my laptop. Why did you tell me now? Liam looked up from his screen. Because hiding it stopped feeling honest. right before the biggest competition of our lives. I asked. That timing is terrible. He nodded with a small smile. Probably. I sighed, rubbing the back of my neck. Do you have any idea what this has done to my brain? More than you think. I cannot even tell which memories are real anymore. Liam leaned back in his chair. The memories are all real, Ethan. Only your interpretation changed. That answer stayed with me. My interpretation changed, not the memories themselves. I wanted to be frustrated with him. I wanted to blame him for waiting so long. Instead, I found myself frustrated with my own certainty. I had been so convinced that I understood our rivalry that I never questioned it. Around noon, Professor Alvarez stopped by to review our progress before the regional qualifying presentation. We demonstrated the latest prototype, answered questions, and walked through our research. When we finished, she smiled proudly. This is the strongest project I have seen from either of you, she said. You finally learned the difference between competing against each other and bringing out the best in each other. After she left, neither of us spoke for several moments. Then Liam quietly said, She is right. I looked at him. About which part? All of it. I wanted to argue, but the words never came. Because deep down I knew he was right too. That afternoon we headed across campus to test our prototype with a group of volunteer students. The session went better than expected. People praised the design, offered thoughtful feedback, and seemed genuinely excited about what we had built together. Watching strangers admire something we had created as a team felt surprisingly satisfying. More satisfying than winning alone ever had. As the volunteers packed up to leave, one freshman smiled at us and said, You two make a great team. You can tell you really trust each other. Liam thanked him with an easy grin. I forced a smile, but inside those words echoed far longer than they should have. Trust. Did I trust him? Without thinking, I watched Liam helping stack chairs after everyone else had left. He was humming quietly to himself, completely unaware that I was looking at him. For the first time in years, I realized I was no longer measuring him by the number of competitions he had won. I was measuring him by the kind of person he had always been. That realization should have made everything simpler. Instead, it left me wondering whether the hardest competition I had ever faced was not against Liam Carter at all, but against the version of myself that had been too stubborn to see what had been standing right in front of me all along. The regional finals arrived faster than either of us expected. One moment we were polishing presentation slides in the Innovation Center, and the next we were standing inside a convention hall in downtown Chicago surrounded by some of the brightest college teams in the country. Giant screens displayed project numbers while judges moved from booth to booth with clipboards in hand. Normally, an event like this would have filled me with nervous energy, but this time something else occupied every corner of my mind. Every time I glanced toward Liam, I remembered the notebook, the photographs, and the words he had quietly carried for more than a decade. We completed our demonstration without a single mistake. Questions came quickly, and somehow our answers flowed together naturally. I would begin explaining a technical feature, and Liam would seamlessly expand on the design philosophy behind it. He would describe the user experience, and I would support it with data. We were no longer taking turns. We were building on each other. As the judges walked away, one of them smiled and said, You two communicate like longtime partners. Neither of us corrected him. Later that evening, the finalists gathered inside the main ballroom for the awards ceremony. Hundreds of students filled the room, dressed in business attire and trying to appear calmer than they actually felt. I stood beside Liam near the back of the stage, pretending to read the program while secretly wondering whether he could hear how loudly my heart was beating. Third place was announced. Then second. Our project had not been called. Liam looked toward me with cautious optimism. I could only shrug. The host opened the final envelope, smiled, and announced our names together. For a second, neither of us moved. Then applause filled the ballroom, and reality finally caught up with us. We walked onto the stage side by side, accepted the trophy, shook hands with the judges, and posed for photographs beneath a shower of flashing cameras. I had imagined this moment for years, but somehow the trophy felt lighter than I expected. What mattered most was not the award resting in my hands. It was the person standing beside me. After the ceremony ended, we slipped outside onto a quiet terrace overlooking the Chicago skyline. The evening air carried just enough of a cool breeze to make the city lights shimmer across the river below. Neither of us spoke immediately. We simply leaned against the railing, enjoying the rare silence that follows months of relentless work. Finally, Liam smiled to himself. "You know," he said softly, "I spent 10 years trying to beat you." I laughed. "That is not exactly how I remember it." He looked down at the trophy before meeting my eyes again. "Maybe not. But somewhere along the way I realized I did not want to keep competing forever." My heartbeat quietly accelerated. He took one slow breath, his usual confidence replaced by something far more vulnerable. "Can I ask you something?" I nodded. "Of course." His smile became smaller, almost shy. "Can I stop competing with you and take you on one date?" The question hung gently between us. There was no audience now, no judges, no classmates, just two people standing beneath a city skyline after finally reaching the finish line together. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. Every version of myself from the past seemed to whisper that this was impossible. The person standing there now knew better. I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in years. "I think," I said quietly, "our first competition ended tonight." Liam raised an eyebrow. "Does that mean yes?" I laughed. "Yes. One date." The relief that crossed his face was so genuine that it erased every remaining doubt I had ever carried. For the first time since we met as nervous teenagers at a county science fair, neither of us was trying to finish ahead of the other. We were finally ready to see where the same path might lead if we chose to walk it together. Our first date happened exactly 1 week later, and it was nothing like I had imagined. There were no expensive restaurants, no grand gestures, and no attempt to impress each other with carefully rehearsed conversations. Liam picked a small cafe near the river where we had both stopped countless times after competitions without ever sitting down together. We ordered sandwiches, shared a slice of apple pie, and spent nearly 3 hours talking about everything except trophies, rankings, or grades. We laughed about the ridiculous science fair projects we had built as teenagers, the professors who always confused our names, and the rumors that students had invented about our so-called legendary rivalry. Somewhere between the coffee and dessert, I realized I was meeting Liam for the very first time. Not the rival I had created in my own head, not the competitor I had measured every achievement against. Just Liam. Kind, patient, thoughtful. The man who remembered that I always skipped meals when I became focused. The man who quietly carried old photographs because they reminded him of moments that I had forgotten. The man who had waited years without asking for anything in return. As graduation approached, life became wonderfully busy. We accepted interviews with the company that had sponsored the National Innovation Challenge, completed final exams, and packed our apartments into cardboard boxes that never seemed big enough. Friends kept asking when our rivalry would officially end. Liam always smiled before looking at me. I finally learned to answer first. It already did. Most people laughed, assuming I was joking. We never corrected them. Graduation morning arrived beneath a bright blue sky that stretched over Lakeshore University like a perfect farewell. Families filled the stadium with cameras, flowers, and proud smiles. As graduates lined up in black gowns, I found Liam standing beside me exactly where he had somehow managed to stand during so many important moments of my life. We exchanged one quiet look before walking onto the field together. When my name was called, I crossed the stage feeling grateful. When Liam's name followed moments later, I found myself applauding louder than anyone around me. It no longer mattered who walked first. After the ceremony ended, we wandered back across campus one last time. The Innovation Center was quiet. The project room where we had argued for weeks sat empty except for a few forgotten dry erase markers. The whiteboards had already been cleaned, leaving only blank space where countless ideas had once covered every inch. Liam rested one hand against the doorway and smiled. "Funny," he said softly. "What is?" I asked. "I thought this room was where our biggest competition happened." I looked around before shaking my head. "No." He raised an eyebrow. "No." I smiled. "This is where we finally stopped competing." He laughed, the same warm laugh that had once annoyed me more than anything else. Now it sounded like home. As we stepped outside, the late afternoon sunlight stretched long shadows across the campus sidewalks. Students hurried past us, beginning journeys we had already finished. Liam reached for my hand with quiet uncertainty, giving me every chance to pull away if I wanted to. Instead, I laced my fingers with his. It felt surprisingly natural, as though we had been walking side by side much longer than either of us realized. "Can I ask you one last question?" he said. Anything. He smiled. Will you promise me something? Depends on what it is. His eyes sparkled with the familiar playful confidence that had once challenged me from across competition stages. Promise you will never let me become boring. I laughed so hard that a few passing graduates turned to look at us. Only if you promise something too. What is that? I squeezed his hand gently as we continued down the familiar path toward the campus gates. Promise you will never let me win too easily. He grinned, pretending to think it over before nodding once. Deal. We walked forward together, leaving behind every scoreboard, every ranking, and every unfinished misunderstanding. For years I believed life was about crossing the finish line before everyone else. Liam quietly taught me something far more important. Sometimes the greatest victory is finding the one person worth slowing down for, because the best journeys are never about who reaches the destination first. They are about choosing to walk the rest of the road together.